Hello everyone, welcome to another video. In this video, I'll be talking about the various types of checkmates in chess. We'll be looking at the most basic checkmates or endings which a player must know. So we'll be starting with a queen, then we'll be looking at two rooks, then we'll be moving on to a single rook, how to checkmate a king with a single rook, and then finally we'll look at how to checkmate with two bishops. So without further delay, let's get started. So notice that in all of these examples, I have placed the pieces of the winning side on the worst possible squares to show you a concrete way to win. In all of the examples, I'll be following certain themes, activating the king, activating the piece that you have, in this case the queen, and with the help of the king and the queen, or king and any other minor piece or major piece, will try to drive the opponent's king to a corner of the board, to one of the corners of the board, and then try to checkmate. So let's see how to checkmate with the queen. So first thing is activating your king. Remember, so you activate your king, he gets his king, you then activate your piece, in this case it's the queen. So notice how with this one move you are controlling these squares so that the king has access to only the left side corner of the board. Now he has two legal moves. He can either go to king d5 or play king c4. Let's look at king d5. Whenever the king goes back, you activate your king. So king moves here, you activate your king. King moves here. Whenever he tries to escape, you get your queen into the game, controlling these files so that the opponent's king has lesser access and it is forced to go to the corner of the board. So let's say he goes king d7, you get your king. Now once he steps into the last rank of the board, it is very important for you to not fall into the stalemate tricks. So whenever the king steps on the 8th rank, always keep this in mind. This happens especially when you are under severe time pressure, when you have around 10 seconds or 20 seconds on the clock in over the board tournaments. It is easy to miss stalemate tricks that your opponent might have under his sleeve. So it is this is one of the techniques that I follow myself to always get the queen diagonally to the 7th rank of the board. In this example, let's say my queen was here, then I would play queen h7, getting my queen to the 7th rank of the board and restricting the opponent's king to the last rank. So in this case, with queen h7, you can see that I have cut off the king and the king has access only to 8th rank. So once you have cut off the king, doesn't matter whichever way he goes, you get your king into the game and then checkmate on the next move. So let's say in this case, if he plays king f8, then you have a checkmate. So now let's look at how to checkmate with two rooks. So checkmating with two rooks is fairly easy. In checkmating with two rooks, you even if you don't activate your king, it is totally fine. You can still checkmate the opponent's king. Let's see how we can do that. So in this case, let's say it's black to move and opponent plays here. So you control this file with one of the rooks, and let's say the king moves here. You try to control the other file with the other rook. Now with the check, and his king has to step back, and you play this check, and the king goes to e6. Now it is very important to get your rook far from the king so that you can activate your rook by giving a check. Now notice in this example I can't play something like rook f6 check because he will simply take it. So that's not something which is possible. So I can't play rook f6. So instead you should go rook b4. Notice how in checkmating with two rooks the king is not required. Even if you do not activate the king, it's totally fine. So let's say if he plays king d6, you play rook b6 check. Now he goes king c7. Whenever he tries to attack your rooks, or whenever he tries to come closer to your rooks, the thing you have to remember is to get the rook far from the king. Whenever the king is on the left side, you get the rooks to the right side, and if the king is to the right side, you get the rooks to the left side, vice versa, so that the king cannot attack the rooks. So let's say now the king goes to b7. Now notice that I can't play rook a7 check. So what I do is I get my rook far, I get my rook to g5. Notice how on the next move I can play rook g7 and force the king to the last rank. So let's say he plays king c7, then you play rook g7 check, king d8, rook at checkmate. This is how you checkmate with the two rooks. Now let's look at how to checkmate with the lone rook. So this is a bit tricky, tougher than checkmating with the two rooks. So in checkmating with a single rook, you have to again follow the themes that we followed for queen. Activate your king, activate the rook, and push the opponent's king to the corner of the board, and then try to checkmate. So let's see how we should be doing that. So let's say black plays king d4, you get your king, he plays king e4, you activate your rook and control this file so that his king has limited access. You cut off the king from accessing this side of the board, right side of the board. Now let's say he plays king d4, you play this check, so he has to go back, and he goes back with attacking your rook. You play king e3, support the rook, and now he has to either step back or play king d5. So let's say if he plays king d5, then you again place your rook here, controlling this file and restricting the king even further. So let's say he plays king c5 now, which is the critical move. You play king d3 and he plays king d5. So in this position, whenever you achieve this position with your king and opponent's king under opposition, whenever there is one square between your king and the opponent's king, we call this as opposition. So whenever you have opposition and also your rook is next to the king like this, always remember this trick. You should always play the rook back one square back towards the king, or even further, so that you're restricting his king. This is generally called as a waiting move, so we call this as a waiting move. So let's say he plays king c5 again. So his idea now is to repeat with king d5 and again go back to c5. So how do we stop it? So we play rook b1. So notice how we are not letting his king escape, and he has to come back to d5. Now we give this check. So notice how his king has to now step back and doesn't have any squares. He can go to these squares now. He has to go back. So he plays here, you play here. So one thing, important thing to notice here is, let's say he plays king d6 and you play king c4. Now he can play king c6. Now again, you can follow the same pattern which we just looked at. So you should always remember this idea. Get your rook back, and whenever he tries to repeat with king d6 and king c6, you control this file, the file next to the king, with rook e1, so that his king can't access these squares. So the only option he has is to go back. Now we give this check and push his king further. So in this process, so let's say here again in this particular position he plays king c7, you play rook king d5, and he plays king d7. You again move your rook back. So he plays king c7, trying to repeat with king d7 and king c7. You go rook b2. Now the king he has to go to d7. Now you play this check and push the king to the corner. Now let's say you play king c6 and he plays king c8. Now what you do is you play rook b2 or b3 or b4. You can place your rook anywhere, and the only move the king has is to go to king d8. Now you play rook e1 so that the king doesn't have this file. The only square he has is this one, which is c8. So he has to come back to c8 and you deliver a checkmate. So now let's look at how to checkmate with a pair of bishops. We are again going to follow the same theme, which is to activate your king and then to activate your pieces, which is the bishops in this case, and push the king to the corner of the board. So notice that we can checkmate black's king only one of these two corners of the board, and we'll try to push the king to the corners of the board and checkmate with the bishops. So let's see how we can achieve that. So first thing is to activate your king. So let's say he plays king c4. Now the most important thing is to control the squares. The king control the squares with your two bishops and try to restrict the king from accessing the squares. So you should play bishop c2, controlling this diagonal. So let's say he plays king d4 here. You try to get your other bishop into the game. You play bishop f2 check. Let's say he plays king d5. You play king d3, and let's say he plays king e5. Now you put your bishop on e3. Notice how this bishop is covering this entire diagonal. So let's say he plays now king f5. So once he plays king f5, you can activate your other bishop. Now notice how these two bishops are raking across these two diagonals, and the king has limited access. So let's say he plays king e5. Now you activate your bishop even further, controlling this diagonal as well. So notice how these two bishops are controlling these diagonals. So this is how you achieve to push the opponent's king to the corner of the board. Now let's say he plays king e6. You activate your king. Whenever the king moves, you, if it is possible, you try to activate your king. So let's say he plays king d6. You play bishop d4, cutting the king. So let's say he plays king e6. You activate your other bishop, and let's say he again plays king d6. Now what you can do is you can come back with bishop e2, trying to access, I know, trying to control these two diagonals. So let's say he plays king c6 here. You can get your king further into the game. Notice how I am pushing him to this corner of the board. So he has, either he has to go run to this corner of the board, or he has to run to this corner of the board. He has only those two choices. So notice how my bishops are controlling all of these squares, and the king has to go to the corner of the board, and it doesn't have any other option. So let's say he plays king d7. You activate your bishop even further. So let's say he plays king e7. Now you get your bishop into the game even further. So he plays king f7. Now you play king f5. Let's say he plays again king e7. You play bishop d5. Notice with every little move, I am controlling the squares and restricting the king further and further. So let's say he plays king d7. Now you play king e5. Let's say he repeats with king e7. Whenever he tries to repeat, you have to always remember this technique. Put the bishop in between both the kings so that the king doesn't have any squares. Notice how the king doesn't have these two squares, and it has to go back. It has to either go here. So these are the only possible squares where the king can go to. Notice how the bishop controls these two squares. Now once he is pushed back to the seventh, so now once he's pushed back to the 8th rank, you activate your king and keep the king on the 8th rank. So now let's say he goes here. Now his idea is to go here and run away. So you activate your bishop and control the diagonal. Let's say he goes here. You go here. You make a waiting move. He goes here. You go here. So now let's say he tries to repeat with king d8 again. What you can do is you can play a waiting move, and whenever he comes back to king e8, you can control this square with bishop c7. So now notice how he has no other option but to run towards this corner of the board. So now he has to play king f8. Now his idea is to run away, but what you do, you activate your king. So he has to go to e8 again. Now what you do is you make a waiting move. So he goes to f8. You control this square even further. So he has no other option but to go to g8. He plays king g8. Now what you do, now his idea is to run away. So you control this square. Let's say he comes back. Now you can play bishop g6 and control this square as well as this square. Now he has only one legal move, which is king g8. So if he plays king g8, you control this square and restrict the king to corner of the board. So once you achieve this thing, once you have pushed the king to the corner of the board, it is very important that you don't fall for the stalemate tricks. So always remember, you need to make some waiting moves and get your bishops into correct position where you can deliver a checkmate. So in this case, you can make a waiting move with the bishop and play, get your bishop back. Notice how he has to go to g8 and he has no other squares. Now you play king g6. So always remember, when you're trying to checkmate with the two bishops, the ideal position for the king is to put your king on the g file, or if you're checkmating the king on this corner of the board, then the ideal square for your king is to put it on b6, so that you can checkmate your opponent's king with this check, and once he moves here, you can deliver a mate. So since it is black to move now, he goes to king h8 and you make a waiting move. Now he comes back to king g8. Notice these little waiting moves are very important when you're trying to checkmate with two bishops. Now once he comes back to g8, you play bishop b3 check. Now he doesn't have any other square but to has to go to the corner and you deliver a checkmate.